Hello, my name is Joe Roy, and I'm the Director of Institutional Research and Analytics at the American Society for Engineering Education. Today I'm going to be talking about the research expenditure data that we collect and the rules governing its reporting. Um, After a brief introduction, I'll go through the official written rules that we have for this data. I'll cover our process for providing guidance and answering questions that institutions have submitted to our office. And then I'll talk about the validation process that we go through every year for the data that's reported to us. Briefly at the end, I'll also talk about resources and discussion of the historical context of the data that we collect, as well as the broader context of research expenditure data reported to other national surveys. So the ASEE collects data around research expenditures for graduate programs. Uh, we're collecting the data around what is actually being expended, centering around research activities and not what is being awarded. The reason this piece of the data is so visible for graduate engineering programs is that it's used by US News and World Report to rank those graduate engineering programs. And if you look on the slide there, you see uh, text copied from their description of the most recent methodology used in this ranking system, where research activity is assessed by two values, total research expenditures, which makes up 0.15 of the weighted average used to rank institutions, and average research expenditures per faculty, which make up another 0.10 of the weighted average used to rank institutions for graduate engineering programs. So before we go too much further into this discussion, just a few um, statements to contextualize what I'm talking about and um, the governance structure of the ASEE that affects these rules. So these rules were crafted in the mid-2000s and have been modified from time to time by our governing bodies. We'll see an example of that in a moment. These rules were written with guidance originally from the Engineering Dean's Council Data Committee, um, and as of this year, modifications to these rules would require discussion and approval from both data committees that comprise our governing structure here at the ASEE. The first is from the Board of Directors Data Committee, and the second is from the Engineering Dean's Council Data Committee. Guidance provided by my office, including this discussion, other discussions I might have had, and examples on online that are posted online do not override the written rules or the oversight function of the two ASEE data committees. We're providing this set of resources in order to make um, the rules and practices around the reporting of research expenditures more transparent so that everybody's working from the same set of assumptions. And then if there are issues with examples that we've posted online or responses that we give, that will provoke a discussion uh, within the two data committees, framing how we might want to revise these rules going forward to remove uh, some unclarity that might have arisen. The second disclaimer that I'm going to give is that the ASCE is not involved in ranking institutions, and we compare the data that is reported to US News and World Report in order to validate data submitted to us. Any the information that I covered before and any links to that methodology should the information that I covered before about U.S. News and World Report methodology and any links to that, questions about that should be directed to U.S. News and World Report itself. So moving on to the official rules. So as I said before, these official rules were originally written in the mid-2000s and have been updated time to time by our governing bodies. So my reading of these rules, and given how they are currently structured, is that my guess is that after the original rules were written, anytime there was an issue with research expenditures reported by an institution or a set of institution, that provoked a discussion, and then another clarification point was inserted in the official rules. So this is sort of um, a document that's been crafted over the years and formed by issues individual institutions might have had in reporting the research expenditures. These rules, as they are written, are fairly legalistic in that you should be reporting to us all research expenditures associated with grants and contracts specifically budgeted for external sponsored research and associated programs, and expenditures associated with all gifts auditably used for research. Include expended funds provided by the following external sources. So these are the 7 sources that we collect research expenditures from. And again, the next slide is going to have the rules that govern the research expenditures that are reported to us. So again, there are separate clarifications around what I imagine were things that were reported that our governing bodies, after a discussion with the broader community, felt should not be included within research expenditures. So any portion of academic year or summer salary for any researcher that is not derived from external research grants or contracts should not be counted. So that means basically any piece of salary that's not an externally funded, um, that doesn't have an externally funded source to it should not be included in what's reported to us. Report actual expenditures as opposed to authorization amounts or awards in US dollars. So if there is a conversion that has to take place from another currency to US dollars, the most reasonable set of guidance is that we've found is from the IRS, and that's you should use a justifiable conversion rate that's consistent within your own internal financial system. So you should not be using a separate conversion rate for our survey to report data from our survey than you use for other internal reports or for other tax filings. The time frame for expenditures for this year is the 2019 fiscal year. That is the fiscal year that ended in 2019. We also collect the total number of individual grants, not the total dollar amount of the expenditure. So we'll calculate the total dollar amount of the expenditures. The field that is in our survey instrument is to enter the total number of individual grants. The expenditures reported to us should only be for funds provided by organizations, agencies, and individuals external to the institution. Do not include any research that is funded from an endowment or a general fund. Cost-sharing matching funds should be included only if provided from sources external to the institution. Only state government funds that were obtained competitively or as matching funds associated with other externally funded programs should be included. State funds that are part of the normal operating budget should not be included regardless of purpose. So even if they're tagged for research specifically, if they are state funds that are part of the normal operating budget, they should not be included in what is reported to us. For all joint or contracted projects or sub-projects, only the portion of the center research performed by faculty, staff, and students of the affiliated engineering school should be credited to that school. So if you have faculty working on other projects, working on projects outside the College of Engineering, housed in other departments or units, only the portion that is directly tied to the work that the faculty, staff, or students are doing who are housed within the College of Engineering should be credited for that school. Expenditures for capital cost of research laboratory building construction should not be included. Expenditures for research laboratory renovation should not be included unless the renovation funds expended come from grants and contracts expressly intended for the direct support of engineering research. So basically, you cannot include research expenditures for laboratory renovations unless those laboratory renovations were budgeted for and included in the original um, grant and contract. So expressly intended and justified for the direct support of engineering research. So for the data that we collect data for research expenditures around departments and then also research centers or units. Now, this definition that we have that is displayed here is the official definition we use for what we consider a research center. I do want to point out a few things that affect how we calculate the data. So we assume that if a research center is housed within a College of Engineering department, that you're including those research expenditures within the departmental data that you're reporting. So if you classify in the survey instrument a research center as being within a Department of Engineering, then we will exclude, when we calculate the total research expenditures for your College of Engineering, we will exclude that research center from the total value reported. The reason for doing that is to prevent double counting. That's to prevent reporting expenditures for a research center and then also reporting those same expenditures for a department. When we talk about research centers explicitly, what we're using is that definition that you see here on the screen. And what you should be using to determine whether something is officially a research center or research unit are those 5 points that we see there, those 5 criteria. That is, that the research unit receives budgetary support from internal or external sources independent of department allocation. That is, it also occupies temporary or permanently assigned space with access to university-operated physical facilities and support services. The administrator or leadership is drawn from faculty or equivalent ranks, that it participates in the university's broad-gauged educational functions, but isn't degree granting, and that it's more than a facilitator of research, such as computer center or nuclear reactor, a diagnostic testing or evaluation unit servicing internal or external clients, or an institutional research or coordinating office. So this covers the official written rules that we have for the reporting of research expenditures for the ASEE College Profile Survey. I'm going to talk briefly about how we handle questions about these rules and complicated um, issues that might arise. So I tend to have a very legalistic reading of the rules. So my initial response when I get a question about these rules usually comes from that lens. Um, when certain questions are sent to our office um, that are beyond uh, sort of clear readings of the rules, but that require some interpretation, my past practice for these kind of questions has been to discuss the issue internally with other ASCE headquarters staff, also draft a response for review to the Engineering Dean's Council Data Committee. And so that was for last year's cycle. For this year's cycle, I would also include within that um, the ASE Board of Directors Data Committee, which came into being in June 2019. Um, and usually for that draft response, I solicit their input or make sure that my response is in line with past practices and expectations of the engineering community. I generally prefer to put initial responses in writing. Even if you call me up, I will follow up with a response in writing. Um, and I do invite discussion to these responses by either phone or email. If there's further clarification that is needed, we can submit this formally to our data committees to get a response at their quarterly meetings. In order to facilitate some of the discussions around research expenditures and to be as transparent as possible as to uh, what what guidance we're giving to institutions around this data point that we collect, I've posted some of the questions that I've received over the last year online with um, my initial responses. Over the course of the next year, I will update this, that website that you see here. In fact, if we click on that, um, so this provides the official rules that we have. Um, and then I cover explicit um, questions that we've been asked over the course of the last year, and my responses um, to each. So just another disclaimer, if there is a conflict, real or perceived, between the guidance and the official, between the guidance that I'm giving and the official rules control. And again, I invite discussion when I'm giving these responses to the institutions that are asking the question. If there is a conflict, um, to let's have a follow-up discussion and see if we need to modify the rules going forward and propose a modification. Finally, I want to talk about the validation process that we have for this research expenditure data. So we compare with US News and World Report the data that has been submitted to us and to them for research expenditures in early January. Uh, so this is before the close of the survey season. We follow up once the survey season has closed with another round of comparison. Our survey cycle is not at this point aligned with US News and World Report. Uh, we during that validation process, we split the institutions that show discrepancies between us and US News World Report, or large year-to-year jumps in total research expenditure data. We split that with US News and World Report and reach out to those institutions. So last year, my office reached out to 47 institutions about research expenditures, and that resulted in 5 institutions revising the numbers submitted to ASEE. I do want to highlight that this is a routine process and meant to protect institutions. Uh, it's meant to um, document responses to variances between our data and US News and World Report, along with documenting explanations of large year-to-year jumps. The reason for doing this is that this variability between the two data sets for this specific data point can create doubt about the validity of the reported data. Um, again, this process is routine and common to national surveys that collect multiple pieces of research expenditure data. Within the data that's reported to us, we have, again, for last year, um, there were only 5 instances, and they were relatively small revisions of the submitted numbers to ASEE. The reason that I'm highlighting this validation process and that it's routine is that sometimes the response when we initially reach out to institutions, we're very careful to frame this as part of our validation process. This should not be seen as anything other than routine or anything other than um, commonplace. This is not um, even small discrepancies we will reach out for just to make sure that we can explain what's happening uh, with the data between the two data sets. Um, in general, I will say attached to this, when we asked the Engineering Deans Institute last year about the trustworthiness of different pieces of data that we collect, the least trusted set of data that we collect are with research expenditure data. And in fact, there was a difference between private deans from private institutions and deans from public institutions, with deans from private institutions distrusting the data even less than deans from public institutions. So I'm providing this resource and reporting on our validation process and making some of the discussions we've had internally more transparent in the hopes that we can increase the trustworthiness of what we're collecting and reporting. We have had institutions revise data after the print publication comes out in the summer in prior years. We are so for the period that we're collecting data, for the fiscal year that we collect data annually, final audited statements generally aren't available by the time our survey closes. Therefore, it's expected that there is some revision of the data after the submission deadline. We are working to make this more transparent in our new system that we're developing currently, so that we can not only track when these changes, these updates are made, but also report when these updates are made, so that if there is variance between a printed source and the data downloaded from the data mining tool, that we can better track when that change occurred. Finally, I want to briefly discuss some of the historical context for our rules on research expenditures, and then also a comparison with the National Science Foundation's higher education research and development survey. So the definitions that are used for our survey for research expenditures have their root in the National Research Council report on measuring research and development expenditures in the US economy from 2005. So I've provided a link to that report there. The two chapters that are particularly relevant are the chapters on academic institutions and research expenditures, and then the chapter 7, which talks about discrepancies between different sources of federal data and why and how some of those discrepancies can arise. When we talk about comparing data between data that's collected for the ASEE and the NSF, there are some differences in the instrument that we're using. First, it's not a difference in the instrument or the data, but it is a difference in the reporting of the data. There's a 9-month delay for reporting for the current fiscal year. So for FY 2018, we reported data for research expenditures in March 2019. For the NSF, that data came out in November, or comes out in November 2019. I haven't checked to see if it's out yet, but it's supposed to be out sometime this month. So that's one source of variance, in that the reporting period, while the reporting period is the same, the date of reporting could influence some of the differences between the two data sets, simply because some internal processes might not be completed until later on in the year, after the fiscal year has ended. The NSF HERD survey collects a larger amount of research expenditures than the ASEE data. So the ASEE data excludes several different things that NSF HERD data doesn't. So unrecovered indirect cost, university funded research, so that is institutional funds, internal funds that are separately budgeted for individual R&D projects. We also, as part of that, the ASEE does not collect startup, bridge, or seed funding provided to researchers within an institution that doesn't derive from competitive external sources or competitive grants. So thank you for listening and going through this video with me. If there are any follow-up questions, please email me directly at my email address on the screen, j.roy@asee.org. Again, we will update the page on research expenditures that we talked about a little bit earlier as we're going through the survey season. The rules are not going to change, but some of the questions that we get will, as we go through, will respond and update the page accordingly. So thank you very much.